Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth week of the NSP webinar series. As indicated in the chat box, we will be live in about 5 minutes, which gives us 2 minutes just to warm ourselves, get ourselves in the right position so connection doesn't disturb us. So we will resume at exactly 5 minutes past 2. Thank you. Welcome to the fourth week of the NSP webinar series. As indicated in the chat box, we will be live in about 5 minutes, which gives us 2 minutes just to warm ourselves, get ourselves in the right position so connection doesn't disturb us. So we will resume at exactly 5 minutes past 2. Thank you. tapped in from different time zones. You are all welcome. My name is Kitumezi Fatima Tamotwati.
Okay.
I am the chair and founder of an organization called Black Women Caucus.
Great
And
stuff.
I will be your moderator
So
for
it's
today.
exactly 5 minutes past
Unfortunately,
2 o'clock.
I can't put my
Greetings to
visuals on.
everyone. I will
Technology
assume
seeks
that
to
we are not all
sabotage this
from South
process, but
Africa.
the
Some have
devil is
tapped
such
in
a
from
liar.
different time zones. You are
As
all
I said,
welcome. My
I will
name
be
is
moderating today's
Kitumezi Fatima
engagement. We are
Tamotwati.
on the fourth
I
week
am the
of
chair
the
and founder
NSP
of an
webinar
organization
series,
called Black
and
Women Caucus,
essentially this
and I will be
is
your
a
moderator for
12-week
today.
series that seeks
Unfortunately,
to
I
really
can't put my visuals
unpack what the
on.
national strategic
Technology seeks
plan
to
on
sabotage this
gender-based
process,
violence
but the
and
devil is
femicide
such a
means.
liar.
Now, as many of you will
As I
recall,
said, I
that
will
in
be
April
moderating today's
2020, the
engagement.
President of
We
South
are on the
Africa,
fourth week
Honorable President
of the
Cyril Ramaphosa,
NSP webinar
announced and
series.
approved of
And
the National
essentially,
Strategic Plan,
this is
which
a
is a
12-week
10-year
series
program
that seeks
or
to
framework
really
that seeks to
unpack what the
eradicate
National
gender-based
Strategic
violence
Plan
and
on
femicide in South
gender-based
Africa.
violence and femicide means. Now, as many of you will recall, that in April 2020, the President of South Africa, Honorable President Cyril Ramaphosa, announced and approved of the National Strategic Plan, which is a 10-year program or framework that seeks to eradicate gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. Now, unfortunately, the scourge has become part and parcel of the South African identity, where women, members of marginalized groups, and children are constantly living under fear of brutalized rape, femicide, the list goes on and on. Today, we specifically focus on the six pillars of the NSP and what they mean to us, right? So many times in our understanding of fighting against gender based violence and the interventions we propose, we tend to forget that there are pieces and puzzles that we need to put together to make this framework an integrated and a cross sectoral framework that is able to respond meaningfully to the end of gender based violence and femicide. Before we go right into it, a couple of house rules that I would like to bring forth. Number one, I'd ask all participants to please keep your mics muted. Please make use of the chat box on the platform for your questions, comments. In addition to that, please also make use of our social media platforms. We are live on both Twitter and Facebook at Call to Action on Facebook, at Call to Action ZA on Twitter, under the hashtag our NSP. And also, let's be mindful of the language that we use to engage and critique each other. At the end of the day, part of developing and creating feminist realities is the ways in which we communicate and engage with each other. Most importantly, let's walk in with our hats of learning. We're here to learn, to ask questions, to seek clarity. When we say it's our NSP, we honestly and truthfully mean so. Another thing, please be mindful that we will be running a poll during our intermission, where we'll be asking questions from our participants. Please engage the questions, answer them. This is a way of us improving the learning and teaching experience for everyone. Um, I've touched on all ground rules. The ground seems quite fertile. Before I introduce our speaker, Kwezilomso. She is, wow, many of us have grown under Kwezi, in fact. Kwezilomso is the Women's Rights and Gender Justice Program Manager at Oxfam South Africa. She is a Black, queer, feminist thinker and activist. She has worked with organizations and collectives where there is a shared critique of an oppressive status quo, together with an unrealistic dreaming practice for a feminist utopia. She's worked with organizations such as One in Nine Campaign, Forum for the Empowerment of Women, Johannesburg People's Pride Movement, and the United Front. Her interests lie in and are driven by music and words. Kwezilomso is consistently exploring the themes of organizing and movement building, navigating the nuances of power, sex, anger, love, and a desire for Black women. So, without any further delay, Kwezilomso, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Kidumedzi, for that wonderful introduction and for introducing our session today. As you said, my name is Kwezilomso. The one part of my bio that you left out is that I am the daughter of Mahlubi and Womxn Mbandazayo, and I've decided that I need to place myself in these ways and introduce myself in those ways. I come from people. So I really would like to welcome everybody who's here today. And today, really, we are going to be continuing our conversation on the National Strategic Plan on Ending Gender-Based Violence. And our focus today is to look at the 6 pillars of our NSP. And so just maybe briefly to remind us the way that the National Strategic Plan, which I'm hoping many of you have kind of looked at or have through our various registration platforms and our social media spaces, is broken down in the couple of in these ways. There is a section around context and background, looking at the facets of violence in South Africa, the nature and texture of violence in South Africa. I've also found that section actually to be quite useful even in kind of other teaching practices. So it was put together quite well. We have on chapter 3, we have an overview of the response. What is the vision? What are the outcomes? What are the changes that we want to see? So it's really on page 37 in that chapter, you will find a snapshot. There's a really nice image there that gives you what that the whole document is about. Chapter 4 is what we're focusing in on today, which goes into depth about what are the 6 pillars of the National Strategic Plan. Chapter 5 is what we spoke about last week, led by Sibongile Ndashe, on what are the institutional arrangements of the NSP. And chapter 6 looks a little bit at the implementation of the NSP, which really is being developed in alignment with the M&E plan, which is consistent with the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation processes to try and ensure fuller integration. So just as an overview, that's what you'll find. In chapter 7, the NSP goes into the actual M&E framework, and there you will see the pillars that we're going to be talking about today set against activities, indicators, and what some of the departments that are kind of leading on different areas of those activities or different activities are. So it goes into a lot more detail, and that you'll find from page 66. I'm giving us this overview or like this kind of walk through the document, just so that we know that today we're doing an overview of the pillars and that the detail does exist. We won't be able to, with the time that we have, go into that detail. All right. So at the end of today's session, we're going to do quite a brief story, which we've already started, of developing the pillars. We're going to talk about what are the 6 pillars of the NSP and why the pillars are what they are. And then we're going to speak a bit about the content of each. So I do want to mention that we've had quite a number of campaigns and marches. We spoke a lot about the 24 demands with Mandisa's session and session 2 and the declaration. We spoke about the total shutdown marches of August 2018. But a bit before that, there was a campaign that was started and kind of consolidated itself in 2014, which called itself the Stop Gender Violence Campaign. It was a national campaign that brought together over 90 organizations to start this ask of we need a plan to end the scourge of gender-based violence in the country, and this plan needs to be resourced. And the plan, some of it came out of lessons from how the country had been dealing with HIV and AIDS, that there was a national strategic plan that is meant to rally all sectors around. We haven't had one of those as it relates to gendered violence. And so this campaign became an important milestone in the asking for an NSP and in starting to draw out the content of an NSP. The Stop Gender Violence campaign produced a shadow report. And in the shadow report, I'm just going to go through some of what was identified as priorities for this plan. There were 5 priorities in the shadow report. The first is to expand the definition of GBV to create a more encompassing definition that includes all groups of marginalized individuals affected by gendered violence, and not only violence against women and children in the ways in which we understand, in the kind of limited ways that women and children are understood. So a definition that looks into different sexual orientations and gender identities, a definition that is conscious of different abilities and disabilities, etc. Second priority was about filling the gaps in implementation of existing laws and policies, what we like to call the South African story. In terms of saying that there are laws and policies that are not implemented well, and that there are many gaps even in the existing laws and policies. So expanding training, resources, and accountability to ensure that the SAPS, National Department of Health, and NPA fill the gaps between the law and its implementation. The third priority is improving and expanding psychosocial services for survivors. So here, the expansion and investment in institutionalization of survivor services, especially psychosocial care and interventions. Fourth priority, prevention, intervention, and research, increasing investment in the evidence prevention interventions at an individual, community, societal, and structural levels. The fifth priority was around accountability mechanisms and resources. So a commitment to fully funding and developing the accountability mechanisms required to realize success in all of the priority areas. And so even in the drafting of the National Strategic Plan, this shadow report acted as one of the base documents, an important base documents, together with many other base documents, bits of research, some of the other plans that exist with DSD, etc. Then Tamara in session 1 covered much of this. So, what are the pillars of this NSP? What are they trying to respond to? And what are their outcomes? So what does success look like? What are the changes that we'd like to see? So this NSP, as it sits, has 6 pillars. As we've said, the first one is accountability, coordination, and leadership. The second is prevention and the rebuilding of social cohesion. The third is justice, safety, and protection. The fourth is response, care, support, and healing. The fifth is economic power. The sixth is research and information management. These pillars in your NSP are discussed on pages 43 to 56, but are also discussed in the M&E framework, as I've mentioned. These are kind of, these are the, what I like to call the what of the plan. So what does this National Strategic Plan offer as a way to end GBV? What are some of the things that must be prioritized in a response to GBV? Just briefly again, in the drafting of the National Strategic Plan, a lot of what the consultations focused in on was the outcomes for these pillars. Questions were asked in communities such as, is this clear? Are we going in the right direction? What is missing? Is there anything that is province specific that needs to be integrated into the plan? And so we went into all 9 provinces asking these questions, and this is where we then got to these 6 pillars. Also given some of the documentation and other conversations that were being had through the leadership of the interim steering committee on GBV that drafted this document for us. So the first pillar around accountability, coordination, and leadership. Now, what this pillar is seeking to respond to is poor accountability of the state and society. And by accountability, really, we mean that, things happen and no one takes responsibility, or we're not sure who's meant to take responsibility. There needs to be a place where the buck stops. And this, as it relates to gendered violence, it makes itself clear and clear even through the kind of impunity levels, how many people get away with violence, how the state gets away with violence, etc. So it seeks to look at poor accountability of the state and of society. It seeks to address lack of good political leadership and the prioritizing of gender-based violence, that we need strong leadership. We need GBV that we know is a scourge in this country to be taken as seriously as a scourge by all sectors of society, especially and including the political leadership that is governing. Poor levels of collaboration, coordination, and coherence. This pillar really wants to respond to the fact that, as it relates to GBV, there's so much that's going on, even across government departments, across municipalities, but it's not coordinated well. It doesn't work together well, and it doesn't cohere. So, the messages are mixed. We're not sure what the left hand is doing, what the right hand is doing, and there is inadequate resourcing and very poor levels of trust. So the issue that this pillar kind of stands to try and address is that of being held accountable at all levels, that there be coordination, and that we know exactly what is happening. We are part of a well-oiled machine or well-oiled chorus, to take away from very technical references, and a strong leadership, things that we can rally behind as society, a line of march, as it were. It really wants to focus in on resources. We can't have a lot of plans and a lot of dreams without the commitment to resourcing all of our plans and our dreams. So the focus is on resourcing. The focus is on tracking and on tracing how these resources are spent, and that they're spent effectively across all levels and across all spheres of governance. So what are some of the changes we'd like to see over 5 years as it relates to accountability, coordination, and leadership? Well, we need bold leadership. We need accountability that is stronger across civil society and across government, and that responds to gender-based violence and femicide in a strategic way. So in a way that can enhance our confidence, in a way that has a long-term view, really, of reorganizing society, in a way that is not piecemeal and petty and like, a small intervention here and a small intervention there, that we can all have a kind of what we call a program of action that is clear, that is concise, that is easily recognizable. And that all of this needs to be paid for. A second outcome, which I'd mentioned, really is that this needs to act like a choir, a good choir, a choir where all of the parts come together in harmony, where there's different parts to the response that bring, good music to all of us. and that everybody knows what everyone else is doing, and that this choir needs to consist of, when we say multisectoral, we're talking about everybody, all sectors. So from the faith-based space, our churches and our mosques, to the government and its institutions, to civil society and organizations, to community-based organizations and community collectives and individuals, to the private sector. We need this to be stronger, that these sectors of society are a bit more coordinated, that we all form part of this choir. I know I'm sounding a lot like Together We Can, which is not my intention. Just maybe quickly some of the activities that are envisaged under this pillar. There's quite a lot, so I will not go through all of them. So in terms of strengthening accountability, we need to make sure that people with a history of perpetrating GBV are not appointed to government and public institutions. Here, there are some outputs around how all public servants need to be vetted. We need, as another shorter term outcome, that religious and cultural leaders aren't eligible to continue to hold office whilst there are allegations of GBV against them. One of the other shorter term outcomes is that civil society organizations engage in peer monitoring processes and citizen-based monitoring, so that there's like a kind of a way where we can have horizontal feedback mechanisms that are linked to representativity and opportunities. We also need effective coordination at district levels that responds to and prevents GBV. And one of the lead departments that is being envisaged here is COCTA. Okay. So let's move on to the second pillar. The second pillar is on prevention and the rebuilding of social cohesion. Really, this pillar is about building a story and a reality of a violence-free South Africa, where violence is not the norm, is not the kind of thing that holds this country together in many ways, that the DNA of the country is not that of violence, that the language of the country is not of violence, where we kind of can first try and eliminate violence being acceptable, just as a model of being, as a model of how we interact with one another. We want to make it not normal. It must still make us weak in the knees. It must make us weep. We're trying to really eliminate that violence becomes socially acceptable, and therefore other ways of being and of humaning and of being with each other become what is the norm. Here we're looking at holistic approaches, so approaches that do not just look at people, kind of individuals and like one section of the individual's issues, but what is the cluster of things that people face, that communities face, that the country faces. But these approaches around prevention, we're also wanting to be quite adaptable, and that they must make sense where they are being implemented. And so even as we're all part of this choir, a lot of what we need to then be doing in the kind of minutiae is things that respond directly to how violence expresses itself in particular ways and in particular places. What this pillar is trying to respond to is a really brutal and very brutalizing history. Is the acceptance, as I said, of violence overall, is very harmful norms around society and around gender, things that have become, what is. And of course, inadequate links that are being made between violence against women, girls, and gender nonconforming people and violence against children. But of course, all of these things sitting on a bed of structural drivers, things that are so intertwined and so ingrained, such as poverty and inequality. This is part of what this pillar is seeking to respond to. So really about the changes that we want to see here are a stronger muscle from all of us to be able to deliver on programs that can prevent violence from happening in the first place and violence from continuing. And here we're speaking about all forms of violence. And it's really, we want another outcome that is about changes in how we behave and changes in terms of what we think is normal, the way we are in society, what are the societal norms and values that society has. It's about a shifting away from how, as genders, as gendered people, as people who have been described and have been divided into men, into women, into gender non-conforming people, and how those then kind of get into a hierarchy where people who identified as men are understood as those with power and understood as, and masculinity becomes this thing that is toxic. So here in kind of the prevention pillar and the rebuilding of a fabric, it's about shifting away from ubudoda that is ugly, that is toxic, that is violent, where that is the norm, right? Into approaches that are about expressing masculinities and other identities positively and gentler and beautifuler, which is a word like irregardless. And then some of the outcomes again are about this cross-fertilization and integration of the intervention. So we want interventions that speak to each other in harmony, interventions that aren't about single issues and single kind of communities of people, but that can focus in on the micro level, that can focus in on the smallest detail of a household, but whilst speaking to and having all of its tentacles into other areas. So the interventions around, for example, violence against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer, intersex, and asexual plus people be really included in broader gender-based violence prevention and violence prevention interventions. This is really a pillar about safety. It's a pillar about strong programming where at the end of it, as I said, we are saying that violence strips away at our dignity. And so we're wanting the restoration of human dignity and building communities that are caring, that are loving, and where we can then collectively respond to some of the scars that we have, collectively respond to some of the historic and the collective trauma in ways that are about healing, which one of the other pillars speak to, ways that are about healing and not ways that are about re-traumatizing ourselves over generations, across generations. So we want to interrupt the cycles of violence. I've spoken about safety, and here some of the interventions that I envisage, some of the activities are comprehensive national prevention strategy, about having evidence-based prevention interventions rolled out targeting school-going children led by the Department of Education, a community-based intervention to address harmful gender norms and rolled out and assessed across a spectrum of communities. And here again, COCTA appears and the Council on GBV appears. These are just examples, as I said, of more what some of the activities could look like as it relates to trying to realize a prevention strategy. And so now if we move on to our third pillar, this pillar seeks to respond to really bad implementation of existing laws and policies. It seeks to challenge gaps in existing legislation. It looks at harmony around, the justice, what is called the justice cluster, and alignment, laws, policies, and ways of acting, relationship between formal and customary systems and more common law systems. It seeks to respond to the fact that the criminal justice system is really not victim friendly and is not survivor focused. There are stories on stories that we know, that we hear, that we've experienced, that trying to access justice through, your courts, your police stations, becomes a traumatic experience in and of itself. And it also seeks to thinking through information for survivors of violence. So this pillar really wants to look at the systemic challenges that have resulted in inadequate responses in the management of cases. It looks at the challenges in infrastructure, so what we have to deal with GBV, from physical infrastructure to systems and policies and human resources and the money, right? The money stuff that have stood in the way of delivering justice to survivors of violence and to families of people who've been killed through gendered violence, through giving them what they need, through trying to right what was wrong, or some sense of justice, safety, and protection. So this is what we're trying to address here. Some of the changes that we envisage here over 5 years are that, again, trying to get justice for something that has gone wrong with you or has happened or continues to happen should not be traumatic, but should be empowering. It should be a space of, as our fave Msaki would say, of fetching your life, as opposed to being, oh, now I have no more English, that we're able to access efficient, quick, sensitive, and responsive services with this pillar, and we would like an outcome that is around a stronger capacity, even within the system, to address impunity, to address that people, institutions, the state gets away literally with murder, and to effectively respond to the murder and the femicide of women and of people in general. Another change here is that we need amended legislation related to gender-based violence areas that builds on some of the legislative reforms that have already been initiated. And so at this point, we're going to go into a short break with your poll. Let me show you my nice face. Okay, and we're back. Are we back? Okay, now I see the poll again. Hi everyone. So we're back, and my apologies for. I'm gonna try and speak a bit louder. I hope that's much better. All right, so we're gonna move on to our fourth pillar, and this one. So let me just get my notes in order. Okay. What this pillar is really trying to respond to, the problem it's trying to address, is that, is kind of support services for when bad things have happened, when gender-based violence has happened. And here we're talking about, individual kind of interpersonal instances of gendered violence. So to what kicks in after, say you have come and you are in a situation of domestic violence, and what are some of those support services that are necessary for you, for your family, in your community, and trying to respond to that. So it seeks to address secondary victimization and to really build local infrastructure to respond effectively and to respond rapidly. So we want to ensure that every survivor has access to services that are appropriate, things that are proper, that they need, that are sensitive, and loving and caring, and that can support immediate containment. So for you to be able to be held immediately, and really that what happens once something has happened, and the way in which you are responded to and that you are held, can be a great stepping stone for you to heal from it, for you to reclaim your agency, your life, your body, your mental wellness, your physical wellness, and your life as a whole. So the pillar is really there to make sure that we do not remain in these cycles of pain and suffering after some of these things have happened to us, and that there is there's a next, And the next is a place of healing and of finding some kind of okay, eventually finding some way to thrive. And so this slide speaks to what I've mentioned, that how people, individuals, communities of people, families responded to once they become vulnerable with neighbors, with the police station, with an organization, and say, this has happened to me, I'm going through this. How that happens is so important to what your kind of life moving forward could look like. And how, and to then match that with saying that a healing society is one that is also possible to be one that eradicates GBV for good in South Africa. And here are some of the changes here over 5 years that we would like to see, that the responses that we already have, the places that we already have are made stronger, are resourced to become stronger, that the muscle is built, that they become stronger, and that we eliminate secondary, third, fourth victimization through addressing some of the specific individual factors. So say a police station that is known for being messy, and not messy in a good way, and some of the systemic factors that are driving it, some of the underlying causes that are driving it, and so that that victimization gets taken care of. Some of the other changes here are that victims feel supported by the system. They feel supported by all the bits of it, not just by one person, not, some of the ways in which you will just know that there was a great nurse in that one hospital, but actually the whole thing in and of itself was terrible, but that the whole system, the whole ecosystem of responding to you once you come in as a survivor of violence, that you feel supported by it, and that there's necessary support that is about your psychosocial needs, so your mental, your emotional wellness, and material support that is required to assist you with your healing. By material, we mean things, money, stuff. That there is strengthened community and institutional responses that can provide response, care, and support to survivors and to other vulnerable persons. Again, we take it back into saying that we want to make sure that our communities are built for and build themselves for being able to contain us and care for us and love us into wellness again. And here, I lost my notes. Apologies, my people. So let's move on to Pillar 5. And here in Pillar 5, we're looking at, again, one of the underlying drivers that create the kind of society that we live in, that is not a caring society, that's not a positive society, that is such a violent society. So it seeks to respond to how women's rights to human dignity, women and gender diverse persons are violated. It seeks to look at invisible labor. It looks at the care economy and care work, and this has been so much more amplified during this pandemic. Not that it wasn't huge to begin with. It looks at what the workplace looks like and whether or not the workplace is A, accessible to women, and B, can be a place where women can thrive, It looks at the gendered pay gap, the fact that different genders are paid like different money for the same work. And it looks at some of the more structural ways in which we can start to transform society. So here, around economic power, we look at and think about things such as land justice and housing justice and socioeconomic justice that can give everybody a fair chance and can give everyone the options necessary to lead the lives that are gorgeous. So what the pillar wants to do is to be intentional about transforming the structural foundation of gendered violence across local, provincial, and the national spheres in ways that reshape the economy and society and the value system so that women and LGBTIQ persons are able to freely participate, navigate in the economy, and change their lives. Some of the shorter term outcomes here in this really huge pillar. So this is kind of a pillar around saying that the economy is violent and you can't not have gendered violence in a genderedly violent economy. But some of the changes that we're going to try and look at to see if they can chip away at the structure of the economy include initiatives that are about women's economic and social position, where women are able to access government and private sector procurements. So things like tenders, things like doing work for the state and the private sector as our companies, as our cooperatives, as individuals. We need an outcome that has improved access to land for women and gender diverse persons in the country, financial resources, income and income generating activities, employment, housing, everything. Another outcome over 5 years is around, we want to see a change in the safety of the workplace, wherever the workplace is, be in someone's house as a domestic worker, to the workplace being a factory and you are on the factory floor, to the workplace being around a board table and you are in the private sector, or the workplace is on the street and you are an informal trader. So we need safe workplaces that are free of violence against women and LGBTIQ persons, that is including, but that is not limited to, sexual harassment. And here we want to see commitment through policies by the South African government, through policies and practice, and the private sector. This is one of the changes that we need to see that eliminates the economic imbalances. So for example, if you look at tender procurement things, we need to be seeing more companies and more government entities responding to the minimum requirements that companies that kind of they can procure from are those are women-led. 30% of them are women-led. Oh, sorry, I've been talking so much. I'm fumbling. And looking at strengthening child maintenance and related support systems that can then address the economic vulnerabilities of women. So what I really like about some of these outcomes and some of the activities that are proposed is that it's quite a broad range, right? That responds to the immediate pinch of living in such an unequal South Africa, such as trying to get all people who made a child to try and participate financially in raising that child, to then calling for land justice and housing justice for women, because these things are not at odds with each other, and we need to be intervening at all of these levels. And so we're on to our last pillar, and this one wants to respond to gaps in the knowledge base that we have, what we know about gender-based violence. How bad is it? How does it occur? How does it look and feel and taste? What is its prevalence? We want to respond to that gap of kind of gaps in research, but also responding to the gap of where research that is existing is not used effectively. So there's a lot of research that's currently out there, and there isn't a kind of effective or straight lines between saying, I am intervening in this way as this government department. I am hosting a campaign on, I'm not going to give an example because I'll be spicy, hosting a campaign on X. And the reason I'm hosting this campaign on X is because we did a survey, and the survey said this is how we need to respond to Y. We need to, it also wants to respond, this pillar, to data systems that are not coordinated and integrated. So again, even though there's this wealth of information, there are gaps in information, there are no central places really where you can find more holistic pictures of what this picture is. So information is literally everywhere, giving the information really, it loses its teeth when then we have it, but there's no way to use it properly and on scale. And therefore we can't really identify what's missing. So this is what this pillar is seeking to respond to, seeking to ensure that what gets spoken, what gets done, is in direct response, and there's a reason for it. There's a reason that can be defended for it. Some of the changes here over 5 years are an improved understanding of what is violence by all of us. Adopting, therefore, policies, laws, programs, projects that are informed by that understanding. That the information that we have across government is readily available and is readily used to address some of these challenges. So it's not enough, as I said, to have the information when we can't access it and when we cannot use it properly. And so here we have reproduced a table that is on page 37 of your National Strategic Plan. It's a bit longer, but I really like it as a way of showing us, what the vision of how this NSP and how these pillars fit into what the vision is, right? And how we should address violence. So the vision really is that we need a South Africa that's free from violence, that's directed at women, children, and LGBTQI persons. And these are some of the outcomes at a 10-year, longer term outcomes, that all people who live in South Africa, including government, the private sector, workplace, schools, religious and cultural institutions, are held accountable for building a safe and GBV-free environment, that healing is facilitated, that spaces are safe, and really that we can rebuild society as we know it. We can have a new society that is free of violence. And I think I will pause there. I've spoken quite a lot because there's quite a lot of information to get through. And I will open for questions and discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kwezi, for such an insightful presentation. I think what's interesting is that every time we hear about the NSP, there's always new parts of the NSP that I'm learning, that I am having an aha moment. Just by the looks of our Twitter and Facebook in particular, a lot of people have been engaging with the presentation and have quite interesting comments and questions to raise. But before then, I think my own personal reflections, I want to abuse my seat as the moderator. I think what the NSP does, and just based on the presentation, is that, before I even go into that point, thank you so much, Quez, for showing us that, you know, documents such as the NSP do not just emerge, they don't just fall from the blue sky. That in fact, the document such as the NSP is a culmination of years of struggle through the feminist and the women's movement that have been really calling for accountability and and a more deliberate response and strategy, in ending the scourge of gender-based violence and femicide. And I mean, when we think about the Stop GBV campaign, we think about the total shutdown movement. Many times we make the mistake as activists where we reduce the work that we do as just being on the streets. And to think that just being on the streets is just to be on the street. And we don't understand how political demonstration and political activity and participation has given birth to this feminist document, right? Because just based on what you're saying and how you explain this NSP, is that this NSP seeks to provide what we call the feminist reality, right? And it does not only look at GBV as a standalone issue, but looks at GBV as really as a result of social processes. And so the 6 pillars become very important in grounding and reminding us as people who are meant to engage this Bible of ours that in order for us to fully eradicate gender-based violence and all its manifestations, we need to be deliberate about engaging all sectors of society. And I must be honest that I really felt from the first pillar right till the end a strong feeling of the multi-sexual approach, which is of it's a word we throw around so often, but do we really implement it? I don't necessarily think so. Couple of my own reflections looking at the accountability under the accountability coordination and leadership pillar, Kwezi. I mean, under the when we look at some of the demands under that pillar, we really look for bold leadership, right? I mean, 26 years into democracy, and we haven't really seen that translate. We look at our administrations from Nelson Mandela to Mbeki to Zuma and now Cyril, right? And it's quite evident that we are lacking bold. Sorry about that. The question I want to throw at you, Kwesi, is how do we envision then the women's movement uh, in cultivating that strong and bold leadership that we so desperately need? Because truth be told, Bachaitu, that our dependence on patriarchal forms of leadership and power, are not helping us with anything. And so we maybe this calls for an opportunity for us to envision what the women's movement's role can be in holding in the realization of bold, feminist, equitable leadership styles and structures that really serve the people, not by word of mouth, but in practicality. So I think that's my first question I want to throw to you. And I'm throwing it very deliberately, understanding that you also have a long history within the women's movement and have seen how it's developed over the past decade or so. Um, so that's something I'd really like to throw at you as a moderator. In addition to that, I think looking at the pillar are on prevention and building, or rather the rebuilding of social cohesion. I think we can all agree that prevention is probably one of the most difficult things to do. We know there's the famous saying that prevention is better than cure, but prevention almost seems like a disruption, right? Because prevention says we need to get rid of the conditions that allow for the act to happen in the first place, right? And so I'm throwing this at you. I mean, just listening to
I mean, COVID-19, as everybody has said, I think this has come out of everyone's mouth at some point in the past 3 months, is that COVID-19 has exposed blah, blah, blah. And so COVID-19 has also exposed our shortcomings as society, how in many of the interventions we've used words like we need to introduce changed behavioral programs, right? But are we ready for that? Because for us to change behavior means we are changing the very ways in which we are engaging with each other. And so when looking at the NSP and the 6 pillars, for me, I would like to think that the NSP is quite a disruptive document, right? It really seeks to disrupt social processes. It seeks to disrupt institutions of power and the homogeny they have in society. So that's something I'd also like to throw at you for now. Um, yes, Chris, can I give you an opportunity to respond?
Sure thing. Thank you, Fatimata. I mean, I'm trying to switch on my video, but it's disabled from my side. So maybe we can see how we do that. Also, because I passed, guys, like especially for today's session, I feel like so these are two. I mean, these are comments, right? And they're quite big. I think it's really important what you raise about so if we're saying we want bold leadership, what is the kind of leadership that we envisage? And I guess it's layered. When I was doing some of the consultations, an example I kind of used as it relates to state power, for example, is that none of our presidents, and as you mentioned, none of our presidents can be accused of having the end of violence as their thing. When you think of President Mandela, you don't immediately think of GBV. Of children, you'll think of, racial integration, racial reconciliation. When you think of President Mbeki, you will not think about gendered violence. When you think of President Zuma, you will think about gendered violence, but not in some of the ways that we want a leader to be. So I guess the bold leadership is leaders across society who can provide clear strategic direction, who can help society to reimagine the space of being free, who can reimagine it. No. And in the question that you were asking me around movements, one of the ways to do that, I guess, is to embody the kinds of leaders that we would like to see and we would like to be. And that embodiment comes with, as a feminist, for me, it comes with a sense of vulnerability. It comes with a sense of saying, at some point, Africa, I don't know how we do this. I don't know what we talk about, and at the end of the day, can we be quite clear about how we implement it? It is about being flexible, because all of us, these people who are trying to model accountable leadership, bold leadership, violence-free leadership, are coming from this violent society. So it's kind of trying to act against the mold. And sometimes we fall back into the mold. And what are some of those accountability mechanisms? What are the ways in which we take responsibility, we rehabilitate, and we move on? It's a big question, but we need to be seeing across sectors of society people who are making conscious, informed decisions around how we're ending violence, how we're going to end violence, and how we're going to deal with violence, who can lead the rest of us in thinking and in acting, who can inspire the rest of us to keep at it. And we can't accuse any of the current leadership of doing that. So we need to be seeing people more out there, speaking out, doing better, acting, giving money to movements, being in movements, etc., that seek to end gendered violence. I do agree, Fatimata, that there are definitely parts of the National Strategic Plan that are quite disruptive and are quite cheeky. You know, at the end of the day, it remains a policy document, so it is not the kind of rallying political document that maybe many of us are used to, or that can inspire us. But there are definitely ways in which, so for example, the centering of the fact that as a society, violence breaks us in our psyches, in our bodies. It breaks how we are able to have livelihoods, and therefore we need to heal. Healing is such a central part of this national strategic plan in such nicely disruptive ways, because you know this is a policy document, right? And of course, the language of healing and the practices of healing, although have been done for generations, we want to relegate to what masculinist politics will call softer issues. And it's not that. It's quite political, and it's quite radical to center a healing agenda in an agenda around ending gendered violence. I also think that the fact that we have economic power as a separate pillar was one of those disruptive moments. I think what we do with it will kind of the devil, as they say, not the devil, the nice person will be in the detail. But I think the fact that, for example, I was in the meeting when it was decided that we're not going to say economic empowerment or economic opportunities. We want to build women's economic power so that women are active agents of shaping, of being seen and recognized as shaping the South African economic landscape. So the fact that much of the labor of women and gender non-conforming people goes unpaid, under-recognized, that languaging in and of itself was sought to disrupt what we understand to be violence and the causes of violence, and took it away again from interpersonal acts of violence into a thing that we know is structural, is societal, and is caused by some of these like this broken economy that we're in. And so that was another quite disruptive moment.
Thank you so much for that, Kwezi. I think I intentionally threw you with that loaded question, and hoping that even for those of you who are tuned in from social media, from Twitter, from Facebook, that you are also able to help us envision and envision possible answers to these questions, right? Because the questions we are asking are questions that affect us all in different and varying ways. But speaking of economic power, Quiz, I think what's quite interesting, and I want to go back a bit to COVID-19, right? Because I don't think when we understand our understanding and the interpretation of the National Strategic Plan should not necessarily be a moment in history. Yes, a moment in history may have given birth to it, but it is a document that must live across contexts, moments, political times. And so when we look at the COVID-19 space, recently a study came out to say that when we looked at the retrenchments, I know that South Africa's got the highest youth unemployment rate globally. And when we looked at the retrenchments, I mean, 2/3 of the people who were being retrenched in the past 3 months were women. But in the same breath, 2/3 of the beneficiaries of social grant services, such as the unemployed grant, were men. So it still says that even though we have so even though we've got institutions right in place that are meant to respond, that are meant to come in, that are meant to support victims, right? Uh, they do the opposite. In fact, they make us more vulnerable. And this really is a build up onto a question that we received on Facebook from Umpoplaki, who says,
how can the Department of DSD better understand better and as much invest in the programs that affect or give effect to this pillar? And she was making a specific reference to the second pillar. But I think that question really cuts across all six pillars to say, what is the role of our institutions? What is the role of the state and the state machinery in really cultivating and bring the realization of these pillars? I mean, it said this, that the South African crisis is that we look so good on paper, but we struggle to translate that into our lived and daily realities. So what then becomes the role of the judiciary, for example, Department of Social Development, that really has a responsible of cultivating to some extent social cohesion, the one that we speak of? What is the responsibility of our finance ministry in ensuring that economic power is actually attained and that it's not just a hashtag or a phrase that we use so loosely? How then, where do our institutions fit into all of this?
All right, Fatima. I think you maybe have some background noise, but it's a nice question. So as I'd mentioned earlier, the chapter, I think it's chapter 7 of the National Strategic Plan has the M&E framework. And in that M&E framework, I'd started to mention some of those examples. But as I'd said, today's session, we were really just supposed to say, what are the pillars? What are the priorities, right? But in this chapter, there are examples of activities. And in the examples of the activities are then there's like short-term outcomes, there are outputs, so what must we see? And there's a box there that talks about lead department. So if I'm looking at my document now, I know the ones that I didn't maybe look at. So if we think about economic power, right? One of the shorter term outcomes here is develop, implement, and support and monitor programs for equitable job creation, representation, and of ownership by women. And there's a list there of outputs: job opportunities with employment targets, community-based approaches to saving and income generation nurtured and rolled out. And we have the YDA, we have the Department of Women, we have now I'm getting lost in the acronyms, but there are relevant departments that have been identified. This does not mean that they should be the only people leading this. And in terms of civil society, there is, for example, activities, say, with the research and information management. We want a national prevalence study, and here the people who are being tasked with doing that is Stats SA, right? It's in the NSP. So there is a role for everyone to find themselves, I think, is part of what I'm saying, to find themselves in the things that resonate with them and their community or their organization the most, and to see which of the government departments have been tasked with it, but to also then say, look, the prevalence study is being led by Stats SA, but we as a union of churches really would like to get involved in this research. And so we're going to place ourselves there and give this a task to ourselves. I don't know how best I can answer that question, right? Like, all sectors have a role to play, and there's been a big attempt at trying to bring all sectors together in saying, here are some proposals about who could do what and how this can be monitored and who should lead it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Kwezi. Just to follow up to that, now that we are... Kwezi?
Yeah? No, please.
Oh, sorry about that. Just a follow-up question.
Just a follow-up question to that. So an interesting question came in asking, and this is by Umpoplaki as well, is that how can small NGOs with small voice, without political muscle, still assist poor, particularly women in rural areas who have vast land that is not being used for over 25 years and cannot penetrate the current available opportunities to use their land? I know that the question of land did come up under the economic pillar. And how would you best respond to this question, Quez?
So I think I'm going to have a similar response, which is to say that for example, COCTA is the department that deals with municipalities. Again, I'm sorry, my language is gone. But COCTA is mentioned a couple of times as a lead department on a couple of things. There is I know that in the prevention program, as an example, there is a huge reliance on district level implementation programs and district level prevention programs. And so in the implementation of this NSP, even the council that needs to be set up has to ensure that it can get to as many people as possible, most especially people on the margins, so people who would not ordinarily, so as the example that Mpoplaji is giving. So I would say that smaller organizations, again, should find themselves in the document and find where their programs and projects can align to some of the things that are said here, and see who in the state is accountable for that in their local community. So if there's a program, if there's a prevention program that the local council is supposed to run, then we connect with the local council and we say, look, we can design this for you as this NGO, give us the money in the IDP, and here's the partnership. There's multiple ways in which we can try and then find ourselves here. But I mean, I think, as we had said, what we want to know first and foremost is, what does this NSP say should be done, right? And then we can go into a process of appraising exactly how will it be done, and appraising whether this is enough or whether this is that.
Thank you so much for that one, Kwezi. I have just been alerted by our organizers that we are running out of time. Kwez, I will give you a few minutes just to give us some closing remarks. But before we do that, I just want to remind all participants that we do have a survey at the end of the webinar. This will be sent directly to your email address. This will be alongside the resources and today's presentation. The reality is that the process of the NSP is a loaded one and a long-term one. And this is why we still have 8 more sessions left. So please prioritize every Thursday between 2 and 4 that we join our NSP webinar series for more engagement, for more questioning. After all, it is our process. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to moderate the session for you. Kwezilomso, over to you for your closing remarks, please.
Thanks, Kitumeti. I've spoken quite a lot. I think to thank everybody for joining us and to really encourage people to continue to join us. We really do need to empower ourselves with knowing the things that are meant to speak for us and the things that are implemented for us, so that we can be real co-creators in the process. So I'm really thankful for the platform and for the space that we have created to be able to say, what is the NSP? And really that we can build this culture. There's all kinds of things that are said about us in civil society, many of which are not necessarily fair. And part of it is kind of how we can't really engage in some of the technical conversations. And we need to be building that muscle so that we match our activism and our politics and our knowledge, and we are these holistic, serious threats to the establishments. You mentioned, Fatimata, that a lot of what this is has not just been realized, right? It was fought for. And so in the same way that we have an NSP, we're going to have to fight till the bitter end for how it is implemented and whether it is implemented. This doesn't stop now. Part of saying we have documents and research and laws and policies is that we need to follow them up and we need to know what they say and we need to really find ourselves in them, but also with a wider view of saying, what does the South Africa we want, the world we want to look like? And this is one part of fixing a broken society. This is all in a bigger context. And so I guess that's my closing remark for now. No, closing remark for closing.
Thank you.
And I really do want
Thank
to
you so much, Kwezilomso.
I want to publicly thank the team that is behind the organizing of these, really doing really great work. And please do join us next week at 2 p.m.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our attendees. Have yourself an amazing Thursday. Please don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Call to Action on Facebook, at Call to Action ZA on Twitter, using the hashtag our NSP. If you are interested in subscribing to our mailing list to receive our resources, please follow us on Call to Action at the dash isla.org. We'll drop that in our chat box as well as across social media platforms. Have a good one. Sanitize, wash hands, and maintain social distancing. Don't forget to wear your mask. Bye bye.